Chapter 2: Foreign Entanglements as a Result of Oil. I'm going to preface this by saying this is the most in-depth part of this three-part series, so strap in, folks. The rabbit hole is never ending when it comes to oil and US foreign intervention. I couldn't even begin to touch on all the times the US has involved itself internationally for the sake of oil. And I should note, I'm not a historian. Most of my historical knowledge comes from like real-life lore and other kinds of video essayists. So not all of the chronology is going to be on point here. But what matters is the motivations behind the agents at play. And I think I do have a pretty good understanding of that. So I'm going to highlight the situations most relevant to the modern day. With the ethnic cleansing of Gaza still going on, I'm betting that many of us are left wondering how the situation of the Middle East got so fucked up to begin with. And I'm here to tell you that all roads lead to oil. So let's start where this all began, in the ancient days of 1938. Saudi Arabia, in 1938, first discovered oil, and that quickly propelled its status from some bumfuck desert principality to one of the richest nations in the entire world. Post-World War II, the US saw itself getting more and more chummy with Saudi Arabia, forming one of our most integral alliances. Now, this alliance has been heavily stressed over the decades, but it persists nonetheless. Now, in the decades following 1938, many other nations in the Middle East discovered oil of their own, including Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and the UAE. And at some point, pretty much all of these nations were amicable to the United States. But there was one massive wedge preventing the US and these oil-producing nations from truly getting along. And that was the creation and perpetuation of the State of Israel. So, you know, Israel is given to the Jews by the UN and the West. And to ensure that the Israelis have quote-unquote space to live, the Zionists and UK military munitions and the whole coalition expelled 700,000 Palestinians from their ancestral homelands. And so that event, known as the Nakba, the catastrophe, rightfully pissed off pretty much all of its Arab neighbors. And, you know, that's pretty obvious why everyone in the surrounding area would be kind of mad about that. And at the time, the US wasn't really that involved in Israel. But as the decades passed, the US saw itself getting more and more resolved to defend Israel at any cost. And so this tension between Israel, the Arab League, and the US would lead to devastating outcomes. What I see as the most significant event when it comes to oil and US foreign policy was the parliamentary election of Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran. As prime minister, Mossadegh nationalized Iran's oil industry. Him and many of the people of Iran felt that they had been undercutting themselves for the sake of pleasing the UK oil market. And so Iran said, no more. We're going to charge fair prices so that we can see a return on our investments. And you know, it just so happens that 2 years after Mossadegh was placed in charge, he would be overthrown in a coup. And you'll never guess who was behind that. Yeah, that's right, the CIA and the UK Special Forces were 100% involved in starting the coup, using propaganda and behind-the-scene deals with leaders in the Iranian military. The CIA and the UK Special Forces were able to foment kind of an artificial coup. And so after Mossadegh was overthrown by this force created by foreign interlopers, a Shah much more friendly to the West would be installed, much to the chagrin of the Iranian people. But time would tell that this was a colossal mistake. This was a sin that would never be forgiven. Fast forward to 20 years later, and the Shah of Iran would once again be overthrown, this time by a genuine populist coalition that was unfortunately co-opted by Shia fundamentalists the last second. And so the new theocratic government of Iran would be openly and aggressively hostile towards the US and the West in general. The Ayatollahs would use anti-US posturing to maintain the legitimacy of their theocratic reign, and this posturing would place them in direct opposition to Saudi Arabia and Israel, the US's closest allies in the Middle East. And so this tension between the three countries would lead to a 40-year pseudo-Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Iran that has lasted until today. And funnily enough, one could argue that Iran has turned out to be the US's most threatening foreign adversary. Not China, not Russia, but little old Iran. And to understand why, we need to understand a bit of the geography of the region. Iran itself has huge oil fields of its own, making it a major player in the market for oil. But where things get precarious is the fact that Iran borders Iraq, Kuwait, and the Persian Gulf, all places with massive shares of the world's oil supply. And it also just so happens that Saudi Arabia's largest oil fields border the Persian Gulf as well. So if Iran were to become a belligerent military power, it could have its way, plundering places like Bahrain and Qatar and the UAE, and even breach its way all the way to the eastern shore of Saudi Arabia. And if this were to happen, it would give Iran an unprecedented share of the global oil supply, allowing it to do catastrophic damage to the economies of the West by, sanctioning the oil trade against us. And we all know Iran would, too, if it could. And even if Iran couldn't conquer these places like Bahrain and Kuwait, it could simply just blow up the oil plant. It's not really that hard to lob missiles at the most flammable location possible, right? And that would undoubtedly plunge the world into a recession. So despite Iran not being a real military threat at all, its potential for economic warfare is immeasurable, and its motivation to do so is extremely high as well. And as a result, the US has taken a policy to never allow this to happen. That's why we sanction the ever-loving hell out of Iran and treat it like some big bad national security threat. You'll even hear Republican ghouls calling for war with Iran, despite there being literally no reason to do that. So when it comes down to it, our years-long conflict with Iran was all about oil. But that's far from the only Middle Eastern conflict we've gotten involved with due to oil. Take, for example, Operation Desert Storm. I'll ask you, was the world really that concerned that Saddam Hussein broke international law by invading Kuwait? Or was the international coalition so quick and forceful to respond because conquering Kuwait would have given Iraq a massive sway over the global oil market? I'll let you decide that for yourself. What about Libya? Is it just a coincidence that Gaddafi was ousted in a civil war involving factions led by a whole host of foreign interlopers? And is it just a coincidence that Gaddafi happened to be the man who nationalized Libya's oil industry? I'll let you decide that for yourself. The point is, US foreign entanglements start to make a whole lot more sense when you take oil into account. But let's get to the modern day. Let's talk about Israel. Israel is committing genocide in the Gaza Strip. And yet, strangely, most of the West stands firm in their support for Israel. Why? And no, it's not because Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. That's not even true, first of all. No, the main reason is that Israel serves as a military outlet for the US and its Western allies. It maintains order, at least in a way that benefits Western business interests. And Israel's primary reason for existing is to stand in opposition to Iran, which is our #1 enemy in the Middle East. Of course, Iran knows this, and so in retaliation to Israel serving as kind of a deterrent to Iran, the Ayatollahs have been funding Shia militias to sow instability at Israel's border. And this includes Hezbollah, and most importantly, Hamas. Hamas! But again, the only reason that we even need to oppose Iran is to prevent them from committing economic warfare by disrupting the global supply of oil. But the only reason Iran is even interested in doing that is out of a vendetta against the West, which was caused by the US and the UK preventing them from nationalizing their oil industry. And even though the Ayatollah's grievances against the US are largely performative, they still serve as a justification for Iran's potential belligerency. Without the history there, it becomes much, much harder to find the political will to do any of what Iran does. And we've seen the exact same situation before in Yemen. The Houthis were a Shia militia funded by Iran to destabilize Saudi Arabia and threaten their oil fields, again out of a performative vendetta against the US. And so in both cases, the US finds itself forced to side with a country committing genocidal acts. In Gaza, we have the medieval-style siege cutting off food, water, fuel, etc., and the collective punishment bombing campaign. And in Yemen, it was a similar story, a naval blockade cutting off food, fuel, and medical supplies, and a brutal bombing campaign. And all of this suffering because the US is a slave to oil. Now, I'll be fair, in Yemen, the Houthis were also a problem because of their ability to disrupt international shipping through the Red Sea. However, I find it kind of ironic that the Houthis only followed through on this potential once Israel started genociding the Palestinians. So this all just gets messy as fuck when you start considering oil. I know this got a bit long-winded and rambly, but the point is, oil makes us all less safe. I mean, for God's sakes, you could even go as far to trace the roots of 9/11 back to oil. I'll make this one quick. Saudi Arabia is the largest funder and propagator of Wahhabi Islam, the most extreme form of Islam. The US has supported Saudi Arabia militarily and financially for years because they have oil. The extreme Wahhabi ideology leads to the formation of groups such as Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and ISIS and many other extreme Sunni militant groups. Now, I'm sure one of those names sounded familiar, because Al-Qaeda committed 9/11, and Al-Qaeda has direct roots to Saudi Arabia and Saudi Arabia's money. And even after Saudi-trained and funded extremists attack our country, we waste our goddamn time invading Iraq, because Bush and the gang knew that they couldn't punish Saudi Arabia, lest they withhold their oil from us, their sweet, sweet oil. But Bush needed an enemy to attack, to satisfy the rage of the American people. Therefore, Iraq, I guess, because Saddam Hussein bad, lol. And so, the point I'm making here is that if anything is gonna lead us to a World War III type scenario, it is oil. And I think it's important to note that I'm talking about past and future catastrophes that have nothing to do with climate change. I haven't mentioned climate change once yet. That's how much detail you can go into about the harmful effects of oil. So join me in part 3 of this series, where we'll talk about oil's impact on the environment and how oil companies willingly spread misinformation about this to protect their bottom line. So if you liked my insane, pseudo-historical ramblings, you can like, comment, and you know the third thing. Let's get it, baby. Join me in part 3.